The wind howled across the Rocky Mountains, slicing through the thin March air like a knife. Snowmelt trickled between jagged stones, and on a lonely ridge far from any settlement, a man named Porter McCord lay face down in the dirt, his right leg twisted at a sickening angle. The sharp crack of bone had echoed through the wilderness moments earlier when his horse stumbled on the rocky slope, sending them both tumbling down. When McCord came to his senses, his horse was gone, and his leg was broken clean through. He was 12 miles from Fort Bonneville, an impossible distance to crawl with a shattered limb. The nearest help might as well have been the moon. Most men would have given up, whispering a final prayer to the mountains. But Porter McCord was not most men. He was a mountain man, a trapper who'd spent years carving out a life where few dared to tread. As he lay there, snow beginning to drift over his coat, a single thought burned through his mind. I'm not dying here. Not like this. He took stock of what he had left, a tomahawk, his knife, a few strips of dried meat, and a flint. No gun, no horse, no shelter. But he had knowledge. Knowledge of the land, the sky, and the ways of smoke and fire that had been passed from one trapper to another for decades. He remembered an old saying among the mountain men, "Smoke talks farther than a shout." If he could build a fire big enough, the men at Fort Bonneville might see it. But that was 12 miles of rugged valley, dense forest, and shifting wind between him and hope. It would take more than a campfire. It would take a signal so massive it could be seen through the mountain haze. McCord dragged himself to a nearby stand of pine. Each movement was agony, but he used his tomahawk like a crutch, inch by inch, sweat freezing to his beard. He chopped what branches he could reach, then tied small bundles of kindling to drag back to the ridge. It took him half the day to gather enough for even a small blaze. By sunset, he had managed to build a crude shelter from branches, enough to keep the wind off. His leg throbbed with every heartbeat, but he knew he had to keep working. He built his first small fire, not for rescue, but for warmth, to stay alive through the night. The flames flickered weakly in the wind, casting long shadows across the snow. Lying beside it, staring into the stars, McCord began planning his signal fire. He would need 3 things: height, volume, and contrast. The higher the fire burned, the farther it could be seen. The thicker the smoke, the better it would stand out against the pale sky. He'd use pine resin and green branches to create that thick, dark smoke. He marked a spot on the ridge, an open area where wind from the valley wouldn't snuff his fire. Then with his tomahawk and sheer willpower, he began crawling back and forth across the slope, collecting everything that would burn. Deadwood, green pine boughs, dried bark, he piled them high, slowly building what looked like a mountain of fuel. Every few hours, he had to stop to splint his leg. Using strips torn from his shirt and a pair of sticks, he bound the limb tightly. The pain was unbearable, but he forced his mind elsewhere. To the faces of the men at the fort, to the thought of coffee by a warm fire, to the sound of laughter after a long winter. Hope was the only thing keeping him alive. As dawn broke on the second day, the pile stood taller than him. He knew this was his only chance. The wind was right, the air dry enough. If his signal failed, he'd never find the strength to build another. He took out his flint and struck it against the back of his knife. Sparks danced, catching on the dry bark. Slowly the small fire grew, licking upward, feeding on resin and branches until the first thick column of smoke rose into the cold morning air. McCord staggered back, shielding his eyes from the brightness. The wind caught the smoke, curling it westward toward Fort Bonneville. He waited. Minutes turned to hours. His throat ached with thirst, and his vision blurred from exhaustion. But the fire roared higher and higher until it seemed to scrape the very sky. And then, just as the sun began to dip again behind the peaks, McCord saw movement far in the valley below. 3 tiny riders, their silhouettes cutting across the snow. He wasn't sure if it was real, but as the figures grew larger, he recognized the blue coats and wide hats of the trappers from the fort. They'd seen his signal. When the rescuers reached him, McCord was nearly unconscious from blood loss and exhaustion, but he was alive. The men splinted his leg properly, wrapped him in blankets, and carried him down the mountain. It took 2 days to get him back to Fort Bonneville. But when he finally opened his eyes inside the log barracks, the first thing he said was, "Told you smoke talks farther than a shout." The story of Porter McCord spread quickly through the trapping camps. It wasn't just a tale of grit, it was a masterclass in frontier thinking. McCord's fire had worked because he understood 3 principles: signal elevation, smoke density, and visibility contrast. First, he'd chosen a high ridge, giving his smoke a clear line over 12 miles of valley. Second, he'd built a base of dry wood to keep the flames strong, then layered green pine to produce thick black smoke, visible even through mountain mist. And third, he'd timed his burn for daylight, when the contrast between white snow and dark smoke was greatest. Trappers began teaching McCord's method to newcomers. If a man was hurt or lost, he could build 3 signal fires in a line to call for help, or a single massive column like McCord's to mark distress. That system saved more lives than anyone could count in the years that followed. To this day, McCord's story is remembered not just for his survival, but for what it represents: the bond between mountain men. Out there in the vast silence of the Rockies, there was an unspoken rule: you never leave your own behind. His knowledge turned near death into a living lesson, proving that survival was more than strength. It was about understanding the world around you, respecting its power, and using every ounce of wit the wilderness taught you. Historians later describe McCord as one of the early pioneers of wilderness signaling. Long before telegraphs or radios connected men across distances, smoke and instinct were all they had. When modern survivalists study his method, they find something deeper than technique. It's a reminder of human endurance, of how far determination can go when every odd is stacked against you. Porter McCord healed, though he walked with a limp for the rest of his days. He returned to trapping, and each spring, when snow began to melt from the high ridges, he'd climb the same spot where his signal once burned. Some say he'd stand there quietly, looking toward the valley that saved him, before whispering a simple word: thanks. And that ridge, to this day, is still called McCord's Beacon, because one man's fire, born of pain and desperation, became a light that others would follow for generations. You're watching Stories of Soul, where true tales of courage, survival, and the unbreakable human spirit come alive. If this story inspired you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible real-life survival stories from the heart of history. Stay strong, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the smallest spark can save a life.